Hi, this is History with Andrew Allen, and today is episode 3 of my series, The Mexican-American War, Who is James Polk? Before I forget, I include the names of the people I talk about and my sources in the description. As I explained last episode, the United States had refused to annex Texas after it won its independence from Mexico, so it became the Republic of Texas. The young republic faced an uncertain future since the new government had trouble collecting revenue and it had to cope with raids from the powerful Comanche. Worse, Santa Anna regained the presidency of Mexico and launched large-scale raids in Texas. Still, the republic began to prosper due to increased immigration and a profitable cotton industry. Moreover, Mexico stopped raiding Texas after Santa Anna fell from power in 1844, and was replaced as president by Jose Herrera, who wanted a peaceful solution to this situation. Although Texas had been recognized as a nation by many countries, President Sam Houston still hoped to arrange annexation by the United States, but the American government did not appear to be interested in a deeper relationship. So Herrera thought he had time to settle the sensitive issue of official recognition of the Republic of Texas, as long as the United States did not suddenly change policy and offer annexation to Texas. Given the election of William Henry Harrison as president in 1840, there seemed little chance that the United States would attempt to annex Texas since Harrison was a Whig and opposed annexation. Admittedly, Harrison had died suddenly after winning the election, but in theory, nothing should change since the Whig Party opposed annexation. The reality is a bit more complicated, so it is necessary to examine the actual succession. Vice President John Tyler became the first vice president to succeed a president who died in office. Tyler received the powers and duties of the president, but did not necessarily become president, except he acted like the president and had the president's powers. Therefore, his declaration that he was president, not acting president, established a precedent. Actually, Tyler had initially been a Democrat, but he had broken with Andrew Jackson over the nullification crisis because he believed that Jackson had interfered with states' rights. Since Tyler was not a major leader in the party, the main Whig leaders, Secretary of State Daniel Webster and Senator Henry Clay, believed that they would guide Tyler's administration, but he interpreted the situation differently. As the senior member of the cabinet, Webster politely suggested that the cabinet vote on each issue, and the president would have only a single vote, like any other cabinet member. Tyler responded politely that he would value their advice, but he was the president, and they were welcome to remain in cabinet if they accepted him as president. If not, he would accept their resignations. Still, a break between the president and his party was not inevitable, but Clay overreached, which prompted an explosive rebuke from Tyler. Relations between the two men spiraled downwards, and when Tyler vetoed a national bank twice, his entire cabinet resigned, aside from Daniel Webster. Essentially expelled from his party, Tyler responded by filling the cabinet with loyalists rather than Whigs. Eyeing a second term, Tyler approached the Democrats for support, but they had an abundance of presidential candidates and were not interested. Seeking an issue that would bring him enough support to win re-election without the backing of either party, Tyler decided that the annexation of Texas was the perfect issue. As the 1844 presidential election approached, Henry Clay thought that he would be the Whig candidate and he would finally win the presidency, even though he had lost in 1824 and 1832, as well as failed to even receive the nomination in 1840. The leading candidate for the Democratic nomination was former President Martin Van Buren, who had lost to Harrison in 1840. In theory, Tyler's plan to annex Texas would make him a dangerous rival, but Clay was initially unconcerned, thinking that Tyler could never win 2/3 support in the Senate, until he learned that Secretary of State Abel Upshur had lined up the votes. Upshur's discreet lobbying had made him believe that more than 2/3 of senators would vote to ratify the annexation of Texas. He may have been overly optimistic and overconfident in his skills, but it was possible. However, Upshur died during a tragic accident when a cannon on the new warship Princeton exploded. and he was replaced by the zealous slavery advocate John Calhoun, who did not do discretion. A letter from Calhoun to the British ambassador was leaked, and it stated that annexation was critical to preserve slavery against British anti-slavery efforts. Calhoun had probably leaked the letter, hoping to ride unflinching support for slavery and opposition to Britain to the presidency, since it had worked for Andrew Jackson, although Jackson had been a war hero. Admittedly, Tyler and Upshur had shared this view, but they dared not say it out loud because it would fuel division. Calhoun was simply incapable of concealing his fixation with slavery, so senators justly feared Calhoun's slaveocracy and rejected the Treaty of Annexation 35-16 on June 8th. Remember, Louisiana had been purchased after the treaty was ratified in the Senate, as required by the Constitution. Still, dismissing the power of annexation as an issue, Clay wrote a public letter opposing annexation, claiming that it would increase the debt, lead to war with Mexico, and fuel sectional divide. By chance, Clay and Van Buren's opposition to the annexation of Texas became public on the same day, although it is unlikely that it was deliberate. They had been asked the same question around the same time. Clay's opposition surprised no one, but Van Buren's opposition surprised many, in particular, an elderly man in Tennessee named Andrew Jackson. The former president promptly wrote Van Buren that he could not endorse an opponent of annexation and summoned James Polk to his estate. Who was James Polk, you ask? Don't feel bad. Polk did not stand out in a political age dominated by giants like Andrew Jackson and Henry Clay. Polk had little charm, but an abundance of resolve. He had entered politics because he believed that he was a man of destiny, even though he did not enjoy spending time with people. In fact, he became known for his serious nature and intense ambition. That ambition was helped greatly by his close connection to Andrew Jackson, who backed Polk for Congress in 1825. Polk did well in the House, even becoming Speaker. Finally, he won election as governor of Tennessee, ignoring repeated and increasingly blunt warnings from his friends that it was too early in his career. Polk had lobbied desperately, if relatively privately, to be Van Buren's running mate when he ran for re-election in 1839, refusing to recognize that Van Buren would choose Vice President Richard Mentor Johnson a second time. In particular, it looked like he was setting himself up to replace Van Buren after a second term, which threatened the plans of Democrat heavyweights Thomas Hart Benton and John Calhoun. Since Polk refused to give up, the Democrats decided during the May 1840 convention to only nominate the presidential candidate, naturally Van Buren, and postponed the nomination of the vice president to after the election, since it was clear that neither Johnson nor Polk would win and the fight would further damage the party. In the end, the battle to be vice president disappeared when William Henry Harrison defeated Van Buren in the election. While Polk had failed to gain the nomination, he did gain a great deal of public attention. If he could win re-election as governor, he would confirm that he was a major political force. Unfortunately, he faced a talented Whig candidate and lost by a small margin after a grueling campaign. Polk consoled himself that the year had been horrible for Democrats, since Van Buren had lost to Harrison, so he would undoubtedly do better in the next election 2 years later. Except he lost again, after another closely fought campaign. Jackson had been grooming Polk for a possible presidential run for years, but 2 defeats in a row made it appear that he had reached his peak. After digesting the humiliation, Polk resolved to win the spot of vice president on the upcoming campaign ticket, expecting that Van Buren would win the presidential nomination despite challenges from Calhoun, Lewis Cass, and Richard Johnson. Polk still had considerable influence in the party, but his chances did not look good, until Jackson decided that he wanted someone to ensure the annexation of Texas. Suddenly, the path to the presidential nomination had opened up. Van Buren had wrecked his campaign, and Calhoun's resolve to preserve slavery had made him unacceptable to Northern voters. However, there was a great danger of the Democrat Party breaking up, so Polk had to move carefully, which meant campaign officially for vice president and scheme quietly for president. In particular, he could not alienate the Northern Democrats who were loyal to Van Buren, so his name must be proposed only after Van Buren withdrew. As expected, Van Buren led the first few votes since he was backed by three big states, New York, Pennsylvania, and Ohio, but he failed to reach the required 177 votes to be nominated. As the voting continued, his lead slipped and his rivals gained until Lewis Cass had passed him on the fifth vote, but neither man was close to 177. The convention was deadlocked since Cass supporters would not vote for Van Buren and Van Buren supporters would not vote for Cass. Polk was not even on the presidential ballot at that point, but several delegates suggested him as a compromise candidate for the presidency rather than the second spot. Leaders of the New Hampshire and Massachusetts delegations convinced other northern delegations that Van Buren would never win, and only Polk could stop Cass. Polk was proposed on the 8th ballot and immediately had 44 votes. The 9th ballot would prove to be the last, since delegation after delegation abandoned Van Buren and Cass until Polk had received a unanimous nomination. Polk had likely hoped for the vice presidential spot as preparation for a presidential run 4 years later, but he was a well-known career politician with few enemies, so his victory should not be a complete surprise. Whigs reacted with surprise and then joy when they learned of the selection of Polk as a candidate, confident that it was political suicide. Actually, Clay had his own issues. He had a terrible temper, and he had been a serious carouser and gambler when he was younger. The heavy drinking would be a problem for the many Americans who had recently become teetotalers. Polk did not gamble or drink and regularly attended church, mainly to satisfy his religious wife. Also, Polk had won the support of his Democrat rivals by pledging to only serve one term. In addition, he promised to annex Texas, which ensured the support of Calhoun. More important, Jackson convinced Tyler to withdraw from the race and endorse Polk, dismissing Polk with the catchy slogan, "Who is James Polk?" Clay ignored the annexation issue and focused on domestic issues like the banking system, tariffs, and economic development. Although Polk ran a strong campaign, the election was still quite tight. Polk won the popular vote by 38,000 votes out of a total of 2.7 million. And he won the Electoral College due to a narrow victory in New York State where the anti-slavery Liberty Party drew off enough votes from Clay to give the state to Polk. Recognizing that there was not enough support in the Senate for the 2/3 needed to annex Texas, Tyler proposed that Congress invite Texas into the Union through a joint resolution, which only required a simple majority. This approach had dubious legitimacy, since it ignored the need to obtain the consent of the Senate, but it won some support. Still, the debate continued for a month until Milton Brown, a Whig from Tennessee, proposed a compromise, where Texas was admitted as a state, basically as is, including slavery. But once it was part of the United States, the government would divide the area of Texas into 4 separate states that could decide individually to be free or slave. It passed 120 to 98 on January 25th. A similar resolution failed in the Senate, but Polk's victory showed strong public support for annexation, so a compromise was agreed where the Senate would give the president the authority to decide whether to immediately annex Texas or restart negotiations. Everyone presumed that the president would be Polk, since Tyler obviously would not dare make such a decision during the last few weeks of his term. Except Tyler did exactly that and sent a message to Texas that the United States would admit the Republic of Texas as the 28th state. Polk made no complaint, understandably, since Tyler had solved the complex problem and all the blame could be placed on him. Anyway, Texas could now be annexed, presuming that it still wanted to be annexed. Actually, Texas was in the middle of its own presidential election. The contest to replace Houston was between Vice President Ed Burleson and Anson Jones, but Houston despised Burleson, so he discreetly endorsed Jones, his former Secretary of State, who won the election. When Houston made his farewell address at the end of his second term as president, he only talked about Texas as an independent republic, while his successor, Anson Jones, also ignored the subject of annexation in his speech in December 1844. Unenthusiastic about annexation, Jones informed the Mexican government that he would reject annexation if Mexico recognized the independence of Texas. The Mexican government agreed, but the Texan Congress voted unanimously in favor of annexation. So, all obstacles to the annexation of Texas had been removed. Actually, Polk was a serious expansionist, so he wanted Oregon as well as Texas, even though the United States and Britain had jointly occupied the land for 20 years and had agreed to negotiate a solution to the matter in the future. Other politicians shared Polk's expansionist drive, including Thomas Hart Benton, senator from Missouri. Benton was an odd mix of rugged physical independence and a deep love of books. He had fought several duels, including an impromptu bloodbath with Andrew Jackson, but he also owned what was probably the best library west of the Mississippi. The library was not for show. Benton read obsessively. As a senator, he often subjected his fellow senators to speeches that could last up to 12 hours, pouring forth a stream of information in support of his aggressive patriotism. Actually, Benton was odd for his time. He owned slaves, but he was not a member of the Southern slaveocracy led by Senator John Calhoun. Instead, he viewed slavery as an incurable evil and had no interest in the introduction of slavery to the West. I am Southern in my affections, but I will not engage in schemes for slavery's extension into regions where a slave's face was never seen. Instead, he fought to expand the United States because he was a patriot convinced of the superiority of his nation, and he lusted after the trade with Asia that would be available to American ports in Oregon. After consulting with Benton, Polk expressed his expansionist vision during his State of the Union address on March 4, 1845, where he announced support for the annexation of Texas and stated that he would give Britain notice that the joint occupancy of the Oregon Territory would end in a year. The British reacted more forcibly to Polk's inauguration speech than expected, hinting that they were willing to go to war, which sparked outrage fueled by the powerful expansionism of the old Northwest frontier states of Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. This outrage would make calm, quiet negotiations more difficult, increasing the possibility that the United States would find itself at war with both Mexico and Britain. To sum up, President Herrera delayed recognition of Texas as an independent nation because he thought that President William Henry Harrison had no desire to annex Texas. However, Harrison died and was succeeded by John Tyler, his vice president, who adopted the cause of annexation of Texas, so it became the dominant issue in the 1844 election. When Martin Van Buren publicly renounced support for annexation, Andrew Jackson pulled his support from his former vice president and backed James Polk, who campaigned on a promise to annex Texas and won the election against Henry Clay. Actually, Polk wanted more than Texas since he planned to annex New Mexico and California as well as Oregon, which meant potential conflict with both Mexico and Britain. I will explain Polk's plan to expand the territory of the United States next episode. Thanks for listening.